Welcome along to today's show. We're asking today, is abortion a human right? Recently, a number of US states enacted pro-life legislation that would put greater restrictions on abortion. Alabama, for instance, has passed a law against abortion, except where there's a threat to the mother's life. Georgia and other states have enacted so-called heartbeat laws, limiting abortion to 6 to 8 weeks when a heartbeat can first be detected during pregnancy. Of course, the laws have prompted protests from pro-choice groups who say that women should be the ones to decide what happens to their body. Meanwhile, in the UK, pro-choice groups are also calling on current abortion laws in Northern Ireland to be repealed, who also place restrictions on the circumstances of terminating a pregnancy. Well, today on the show, Barbara Ntumy joins me. She's part of Abortion Rights, a pro-choice group campaigning for less restrictions on abortion. And Barbara also founded Christians for Choice, believing that abortion is not at odds with Christian faith. Ryan Christopher is Senior Policy Officer for ADF International in London. That's an organisation which advocates for freedom of religion. Ryan takes a pro-life stance. He'll be part of a team leading seminars on religious freedom at this year's Unbelievable conference. So we're asking, is access to an abortion a fundamental healthcare right for women, as many pro-choice groups claim? Or is there another set of human rights involved in any abortion, namely that of the unborn child? We're going to be looking at a sensitive topic today, so I do warn you, if you're listening via radio especially, be aware of who else is around, and that's just a caveat we need to give you whenever we discuss an important issue and a sensitive topic like this today. Welcome along to the show, Barbara. And Ryan. Great to have you both in studio with me today. Let's talk to you first of all, Barbara, because many people may be left scratching their heads thinking, hang on, you're a Christian and you're pro-choice, because normally, of course, this is often cast as a Christian versus secular or non-Christian sort of issue. So tell us a little bit of your background first and how you wound up sort of particularly engaging with this issue of abortion rights.
Yeah, I'm absolutely a Christian. Have been a Christian my whole life. Some of my earliest memories are going to church with my mum, being involved in Sunday school, leading the choir. I'm a very active member of my church. And for me, I think the biggest issue for me and what made me become pro-choice was that I fundamentally believe in a woman's decision to decide what happens to her body and whether she's allowed to carry on a pregnancy, whether she wants to carry on a pregnancy. And I think that the caveat around, in circumstances of rape, etc., that's the standard we should have anyway. But actually, at the end of the day, it is a woman's body and it's their right to choose what it is that they want to do, whether they want to carry on the pregnancy or not.
What kind of prompted that change? Presumably you probably grew up with a sort of what is often the standard line, if you like, from churches, or was there not anything particularly that was impressed on you about it?
Absolutely, nothing was really imposed on me. I don't think that I believed that abortion was wrong. It was just something I was never confronted with up until when I was in college and a friend of mine got pregnant, and it was just sort of like, well, what am I going to do? Am I going to carry on? Like, what are my options? What are my choices? I don't have the financial means to carry on. I don't have the practical means to, to bring up this child. And I also want to go on to further my education. And how is that going to impact? And, her having to go through. And I was really glad that there was a law that allowed her to make that choice, that was like, okay, I could choose to do this, I could choose to do this. Actually, for me and what is best for me right now, I'm actually choosing not to have this baby because there's other things I want to do. And a later point in life, when I'm in a better position, I'll be able to do that. So that really, again, for me, I think that the key thing is choice. I think that the key thing is people being able to choose what it is to do. Because as far as I'm concerned, as a Christian, our faith is stronger when we choose to believe. Like, nobody asks us or forces us. Right. It's a choice that we make, right? And I think that should be afforded to everyone, regardless of the situation.
Obviously, there's many Christians who disagree with you, but in a sense, when you are confronted with a Christian, and especially Christians I know, who lobby or demonstrate outside abortion clinics and so on, and they say, but life is God-given and life begins in the womb. What's your answer to that sort of, typically Christian response to the issue of what's going on with abortion?
For me, it's I don't tend to gauge particularly on that, because I think we can go 20, 50 rounds about whether life begins at conception. It's very clear that I have a different view. Whether life begins at conception, ultimately, for example, people have miscarriages, for example. Sometimes people's, fetuses aren't viable. So lots of different things happen. So I think in that framework, again, women should be able to decide whether or not, regardless of whatever the circumstances, whether or not to carry on a pregnancy. And I think that, for me, it's especially hard that people spend a lot of time and advocating for what is quite possibly forcing women to do maybe something that it is they don't want to do over actually a human being that's already here, or over actually lots of issues of children being in this world without parents, children suffering. I feel like there is a lot more we could be doing to kind of help protect and enhance the life of people who are here, as opposed to imposing our views on women who are having pregnancies to say, actually, because you've had this pregnancy, you have to carry out through. For me, it's just very, I don't know, I think it's very arbitrary. But again, I think even if you believe that, for me, again, I get particularly upset when people demonstrate outside clinics, because again, I said our faith is strongest when people choose to believe. So standing outside a clinic and berating people, which a lot of the time that is what happens, trying to get people to change their minds, or showing graphic images and stuff, I don't actually even think that's very Christian, to be honest. I think that that's harassing people, that's harassing women. A lot of times these protests happen outside of buildings that not only provide abortion but provide lots of other care, and lots of other people going into the building have to see that, the staff who work there have to see that. I just think that it doesn't portray Christianity in the best of light at times.
Well, and I imagine there are other Christians who agree with you on that. Interestingly, this doesn't always, by the fact that you're sitting in that particular position, split down Christian, non-Christian lines. I know atheists who are pro-life, in fact. So it's not a Christian, non-Christian issue necessarily. And in that sense, we're not going to really be debating it in specifically Christian terms today. It's more going to be about the rights and so on, which can be framed in a perfectly secular context as well. To help us do that today and engage this debate today is Ryan Christopher, joins us from ADF International. Ryan, welcome along to the show.
Thank you.
It's great that you're here, and we'll obviously be hearing more from you and Lawrence and Lorcan as well at the Unbelievable Conference. But this particular area, what specifically does ADF International do, first of all, and how does it tie into the abortion debate specifically?
Yeah, ADF International, we advocate for fundamental rights for all people equally, and one of those fundamental rights is the right to life. That's been a right that's recognised as a natural or moral right for centuries, for thousands of years, particularly by Christians when we talk about Christianity. But more specifically, the modern human rights landscape is very much shaped by that foundational right being true. And so we work at various international institutions, at the UN, at the European Court of Human Rights, at the Council of Europe, European Parliament, and here in Westminster as well, to advocate for that fundamental right for everybody equally, regardless of ability, IQ, gender, disability. We believe it's a foundational right, and so so that right, in your view, does apply to
children in the womb as well.
Absolutely.
That's that for you. I mean, I'm sure we'll come to discuss the kind of differences you have, obviously, with Barbara on when life begins and so on. There's been a lot of talk, obviously, about this in recent months. The issue sort of flares up every so often in a big way. Firstly, of course, there was the overturning of legislation in Ireland, and then calls for Northern Ireland to follow suit around abortion. And then, of course, just recently in the States, a lot of states apparently pushing through legislation that of a pro-life nature. Now, I don't know whether you can explain what exactly the legal status is of this legislation right now, because I understand it, none of it is yet binding, and there's the whole question of the Roe versus Wade and what's on the Constitution and so on, and whether any of this could apply in the end. But what's your understanding of what these laws represent that have been currently, greatly publicised in the USA?
Yeah, I think in the broader picture about these laws and Roe versus Wade is a discussion, if you like, at the legislative level as to whether states have the power to create laws on this issue. That's really, I think, what's being challenged with a lot of these particular legislative measures in Missouri, Georgia, in Alabama as well. And I think the strategic hope behind bringing those laws forward is that there will be a challenge to Roe versus Wade along those lines, at least that states, people within those states, can elect representatives who make decisions on their behalf about where the law should lie on this issue. And there are many people in America, it's around a 50-50 split, who would like the way the law was, broadly speaking, before Roe versus Wade, to be reintroduced. And that's broadly reflected in the laws you see in Alabama, for example. Now, on the opposite side, you see states like New York, for example, that very recently have passed laws that a baby can be aborted up to a minute before birth, and at the same time have removed the ability for a woman to recognise a homicide when a man assaults her and kills a baby that she wanted in her own womb, because there is no criminal protection for that child anymore. So we have local legislators reflecting the majority view often of the people in their various states or cities, competing in the Roe landscape.
Right. Yeah. So I suppose it's kind of, to some extent, is the legislation that's being passed sort of a precursor to potentially those who do want to see Roe versus Wade, which obviously set the benchmark, if you like, in the, what was it, early 70s?
Yeah, exactly.
For abortion in the USA.
That's the legal strategic advocacy aim of the local groups that are actually doing this. But I think it's really important to note that the real intention, the heart behind this, is a love of women and children by those that are advocating for these legal changes. And you'll see in places like Alabama, it's one of the states with the most charitable aid for women who have unplanned pregnancies. There are scores of centres where women can get help for a pregnancy that she feels that she would struggle with without that kind of financial or emotional or spiritual help. So generally this is happening in places where there is a lot of desire to help women who are in trouble.
Well, we're going to dig into the sort of philosophical and legal question, really, of whether abortion is a human right, whether, as many groups say, abortion should be made available, easily accessible to women. It's a healthcare thing. And others who say, actually, no, there's another point of view here, that there's a child in the womb who also has rights. And we're going to be kind of going through some of the classic but important questions in the whole debate in the course of today's programme. And if you'd like to leave your thoughts on today's discussion, do feel free to email the show, unbelievable@premier.org.uk, or get in touch with us via Twitter and Facebook @unbelievablejb for Twitter, facebook.com/unbelievablejb for the Facebook page. All the links, and links, of course, to my guests here on the show from today's website as well at premierchristianradio.com/unbelievable. So, Barbara, maybe coming back to you first of all, I suppose, what's your reaction to some of this legislation that we've been talking about here that's obviously made news on our side of the pond as well as in the USA?
I mean, the idea that you can legislate against women being able to have abortions is ludicrous, because we know before Roe v. Wade, before the 1967 Act, women were having illegal abortions. Women were having abortions they felt were necessary and were losing their lives because of it. Abortion now is a completely safe medical procedure. Actually, the issue then becomes whether people agree with it or not. That really is what the key thing is. So for me, I don't think that it's a love of women. I don't think it's a respect of women when the law says that something that is a perfectly safe medical procedure, women can't choose to have that done. And we know that when you legislate against abortion, women will find other means to terminate pregnancy they don't want. So now we're endangering the lives of women. So we give them choices, which is you have to have this child, or in many cases, seek help to terminate the child that impacts their life, that puts their life at risk and puts their life in danger. And for me, that's what the key thing is. And I keep going back to it because I think the Christian faith is absolutely amazing in the sense that our faith is strongest when we choose to believe. Nobody forces us to believe in Christianity. It's a choice that we come to, renewing that faith day by day. And I think that it's completely unacceptable that we're creating a law in which women can't access what is a safe medical procedure, because we think that our faith trumps, some people do, that their faith trumps women being able to have what is a medical procedure. They say that it's safe, like it's reproductive health.
That phrase a number of times, a safe medical procedure.
Absolutely.
Which put it on a par with taking out your appendix or something like that.
Brain surgery, heart surgery.
But that's the point, I suppose, is that a lot of people don't see this as simply another medical procedure like any other. Ryan, so what's your take on that particular way of viewing abortion to start with?
Yeah, I mean, if we're talking about the procedure itself, there's no doubt that it isn't completely safe, and that is a lie for anyone to say that, or it's misinformation, or it's ignorance.
Why do you say that?
Well, let's take abortion pills, which are seen to be, by most people, safer than even surgical abortion, which can include the dismemberment of a baby inside a uterine lining that is incredibly delicate, for example. So let's take a case that a lot of people would see as incredibly safe, like abortion pills, for example, which a lot of those hoping to bring in decriminalisation of abortion in the UK think should be the normal means for women to have an abortion. The largest study, peer-reviewed study of over 42,000 women in Sweden, found that there was a 20% complication rate in taking abortion pills at home, which often required follow-up procedures of a surgical nature and included hospitalisation for women. So to say straight up that this is always a safe procedure just isn't true. The facts don't bear that out, I'm afraid.
What about the idea that it is just a medical procedure, though, that it should be treated like any other thing you can book yourself in for at a hospital, regardless of whether or not the statistics are true of how safe it is? I mean, for many people, they would say, well, it's not just like any other medical procedure because there's what you're extracting is very different to an appendix you no longer need or something else.
Absolutely, and that's the heart of the matter in many respects that I'm sure we'll come back to again and again, is that the definition of medicine is the prevention or cure of a disease, and a human being is not a disease. And so by any standard definition, you cannot call an abortion medicine. Sometimes there are procedures that need to be carried out on women that would result in the death of the child in the womb, because the primary intention is to save the life or for absolute necessary health of the woman. But that is not the same moral act by any means.
I mean, 2 points there then, in a way, Barbara. The A, it's not as safe as you're making out, and B, it's also the medical, doctors are there to save lives, not to take them away.
But doctors are there to carry out again, the British Medical Association says it's a safe legal procedure, and that is what I'm going to go with, because it is a safe legal procedure. And actually, it goes back to my point again about, so what we want to do now, if women can't access this safe procedure, is to force women to carry to full term every pregnancy that they have.
Women will have abortions whether it's legal or not.
Well, yeah, this is the point we're trying to make. Absolutely, which will then threaten their lives. 1 in 3 women in their lifetime will have an abortion. We know that's a fact. Majority of this country is pro-choice, and we see it time and time again by the level of support we have when we do events, when we lobby, even in terms of our membership. Like, we know majority of people are pro-choice. And you know what? Sometimes I have to ask, if men were able to carry out pregnancies in the same way the women were, and were forced to carry out pregnancies in the same way, people think that we shouldn't have legislation that allows women to terminate a pregnancy when they want to, I think we'll be having a very, very different conversation. Again, this really goes back to women being able to choose what is best for them and what is in their interest. And we are putting the interest of a human being that is already here, that is living a life, that has plans, over somebody that isn't here. And again, a lot of women carry out pregnancy full term. Some people, if you don't agree on abortion, don't have one. I think that's really it. If you don't agree with it, if you don't think it's a safe procedure, then don't have one. Lots of us who agree with it, who think it's a safe procedure, and actually, if we have a pregnancy that we don't want to carry out for lots and lots and lots of different reasons. Again, I think it goes back to the autonomy of women and being able to choose. It is a safe medical procedure, as said by the British Medical Association. And I think that this idea, again, challenging it, that it's not a medical procedure because the life involved is quite frankly not the same level, because we are then trumping the life of somebody that is, life of something that is not here over the life of somebody that is here.
I think we should come back to that whole issue of whether this is, a life that is here versus a life that is only a potential life or whatever it might phrase you might use. But what did you want to respond to specifically in what Barbara's brought up there?
Yeah, right. I mean, what's interesting about the actual polling on this issue is that women are actually more pro-life than men in this country and in America too. And so 70% of those that would like to end abortion completely under the law in this country are women. 70% of those that would like to have full decriminalisation, abortion up to birth for any reason, are men. And, it may well be the case that if men could carry children, which is a great gift in my view, it's this kind of superpower that I don't have. If men could carry children, then maybe it would make them more pro-life rather than less as they are, actually. Because I think many women in my life and many women that I've spoken to feel that what easy access to abortion for social reasons has done is to enable men to get away with their responsibilities, to more easily become abusers in our society as well. And that may well be part of why the polling is skewed the way it is.
Actually, this idea that it's just easy for women to have abortion is also another myth, another lie. Women have to go see their doctor. They need 2 different doctors to sign currently under the law.
This is the UK law.
Yes, this is the UK law. Currently in the law, they need 2 different doctors to sign in order for them to have abortion. I quite frankly think that's ludicrous, because you can have brain surgery, you can have surgery, no 2 people need to sign. Again, I feel like this is another opportunity to say to women that you don't know what's best for you. You have no idea. So we're going to help you try and say, yes, do this, or no, do this. Again, it goes back to the point. Choice is choice. The choice should lie with the individual that is pregnant as to whether or not they want to carry it to term. And for me, I just don't know why this hard to understand.
I mean, this
do you know what I'm saying?
For Barbara,
it would imply that, every single, in that same case, then we should be treating people who have had miscarriages as, as murderous, for example, because their body has rejected the baby from being developed to full stage. Like, for me, this is the argument that you're putting in place.
What do you make of that argument that it's equivalent,
then,
that miscarriage is an equivalent thing to abortion?
Because that's what you were saying.
I'll happily come to that, and address the first point as well, though, that Barbara made, if I may, which is that it isn't easy to get an abortion in this country at the moment, and that just isn't the case. So one example would be various investigations, including Care Quality Commission, an official regulator, 2016 found that 22-second phone calls were enabling abortions. And I've spoken to women that have been into abortion clinics, many women who've been into abortion clinics in this country, and they describe the conveyor belt mentality often. I'm not saying in every single case, but saying often that they experienced when they were going for a procedure. So it isn't the case that it's difficult in that sense because the 2 doctors sign off. That's just not factually correct.
What about the other? I mean, she says, well, if you're going to apply a law to abortion, why not to miscarriage or anything else? That abortions happen in that sense naturally. Yeah. And yet we don't conceive of that as somehow wrong or whatever. But what's yours?
Yeah, and this is where I think, as we're going to discuss, this is where the nature of a moral act comes in, because when we're talking about a moral act, there has to be some kind of intention, particularly if we're going to say an act isn't a good act, right? So if I kill somebody in my car, there's no intention whatsoever, I'm not going to be convicted of murder, right? If someone dies naturally in a field, no one's going to be that's going to be seen as a negative moral act. There's something kind of a natural process there, like you see with miscarriage. There isn't a moral act in that case. It's a tragedy, a real desperate tragedy for everybody involved. But abortion is an entirely different thing. So to compare miscarriage and abortion is to not recognise that one is a moral act and one isn't. One has intent by somebody to do another harm and one does not.
You can't do another harm to a life that isn't here. But also, again, there is no point in this conversation if you said that women have the right to choose. And again, this is the fundamental thing I've said. If you don't believe in abortion, then don't have one. Again, it is a procedure, a medical procedure that if done in the conditions that, is safe, right? And again, the question comes to choice. Women should be able to choose whether or not to carry a pregnancy to full term. And actually, if we really want to go down this line, then every egg a woman has to be fertilized for them to have a child, because if they don't fertilize that egg and they ovulate, that quite essentially you're saying that is another life gone. Why wouldn't we take it that far? Again,
I'll let Ryan respond to that in a moment. I mean, but just as we close out this first part of the show, the right, obviously, that you believe is central here is the woman's right to choose.
Absolutely.
A choice over what happens in her body, and her, I think this is the term that's come to be used, really, reproductive rights.
Absolutely.
Essentially encompasses abortion and so on. But I guess what we're going to come to is whether there is another right involved, and that is whether there's a right because of the nature of the
Can I just add as well?
child.
It is a right because if we don't, and I know because I work in sexual health, if we don't give women adequate access to birth control, which is essentially preventing pregnancy from happening and women getting pregnant at the time as which they choose to, right? We know that access really isn't there. People struggle people aren't given the correct information. Well, then people end up having pregnancies in which they don't want, and then they have to make the decision as to whether or not they want to keep it. That's why it's part of reproductive rights, because if the state and if our society doesn't make things that allows to make women's life easier in place, we will have this and women will have to choose. And again, the law is on women's side, because I said whether or not you believe abortion is morally right, etc., having a law against it isn't going to really change things. All you do is you push women into unsafe places. And what you're essentially saying is that like women should lose their lives because they don't follow whatever moral path is which you follow. And I don't think that's very Christian. Again, it is our right to choose. Our faith is strongest when we choose to believe or choose to follow this or choose to follow that. And again, it comes back to choice.
We're going to go to a quick break, and Ryan will be back responding to Barbara, who joins me in the studio today. We're asking, is abortion a human right, here on Unbelievable? And we'll be back in a moment's time.
If you listen to Unbelievable with Justin Briley on Premier Christian Radio and enjoy the conversations between Christians and skeptics, then this is the perfect app for you. For the latest updates, podcasts, videos, articles, bonus content and much more, download the Premier Unbelievable app today.
Welcome back to today's edition of the show, and it is a sensitive topic today, so if you're listening and there are younger ears or sensitive ears within earshot, then please do be aware that we're talking about abortion, and if you need to schedule this programme for another time, you can always listen back on podcast. You can find the show at the webpage, as ever, premierchristianradio.com/unbelievable. My two guests on the show are Barbara Ntumy. I hope I'm pronouncing that right, Barbara.
Yeah,
is that
Ntumy. Yeah.
Great. And Ryan Christopher. Barbara is part of Abortion Rights. She is a Christian, though, and founded Christians for Choice. Ryan Christopher, Senior Policy Officer for ADF International in London. And we've been asking, is access to an abortion a fundamental healthcare right for women? We've had a number of US states enacting pro-life legislation recently. The question of Northern Ireland's abortion laws has come into view as well. And we're going to continue talking about lots of the issues that come out that Barbara has raised around, does it make abortion unsafe? What's the status of a child who hasn't been born, and that sort of thing, Ryan. But what has caused you to want to specifically take up this issue of all the ones that you could potentially be dealing with, Ryan? Yeah,
I think there are two key elements to that, Justin. The first was a book I read when I was a teenager, and I had your typical state school, I was brought up in Hull, education on these issues, and I'd noted that fertilization is the beginning of a human life in the textbook, so there's that scientific fact. But I hadn't really thought that through philosophically, emotionally, psychologically. And then I read a book by the foremost proponent of abortion in America prior to the mid-'80s, really, a guy called Bernard Nathanson's book. That was called The Hand of God, which he wrote in the mid-'90s. And Nathanson, more than anybody, you could argue, created this headline of safe, legal abortion. And he fought for Roe versus Wade. And he changed his mind entirely when a particular technology came into play. So he'd known from his medical training that a human life begins at conception. But he says he'd allowed himself to be blind to that fact, partly through social convenience, partly through vulnerability and woundedness, but also because he couldn't always fully see what he was doing. And then ultrasound technology came in. And he talks about this paradigm shift, kind of road to Damascus moment for him, where having overseen over 60,000 abortions, running the biggest abortion facility in the world, he came to view that there is an irrepressible reality that the fetus is a protectable human life. He and the other doctor that was carrying out this later term abortion using ultrasound technology both quit their jobs after doing it the first time. And later on, he goes to say in The Hand of God, and this is what really sealed it for me, is I'd always seen as, I don't know, maybe a baby in the womb being constructed in some way by others. And this is the medical fact of the matter. He says, from the moment of conception, there exists a self-directed form of life, if not interrupted, that will lead to the birth of a human baby. And that was really important for me, that the baby in the womb is actually self-directing its own development. It just needs a helping hand. And the other thing that really struck me and it really made me cynical about the overarching narrative that my whole generation were told about abortion, was Nathanson talked about how they were absolutely lying about the stats prior to Roe versus Wade in order to change the law in America. I know a similar thing happened here in the UK too. They were saying 5,000 to 10,000 women a year were dying through backstreet abortions. And what they meant by that were illegal abortions, most of which were actually carrying out in medical facilities, just illegally. The actual official stats for that were 160 a year, not 5,000 to 10,000. And similarly in the UK, Barbara referenced this earlier about backstreet or illegal abortions. Again, 90% of them, this isn't a good thing, right? But were in doctors' surgeries more often than not. They were not in the street or in a living room. And there were around 30 a year in the UK ahead of the 1967 Abortion Act. And that really just changed my mindset as to the overarching narrative that we were all being force-fed in the media by the pro-abortion lobby as well. Yeah.
What do you make of this idea that there's a narrative that's being fed and by the pro-choice side of the argument, Barbara? And some of the things that obviously Ryan has raised there, that he thinks the idea of unsafe abortion, while it's a tragedy if any woman dies because of an unsafe abortion, that has been over exaggerated in terms of the statistics and so on.
I think that that's not true, that it's been over exaggerated. And if majority of those procedures, although illegal, were happening in doctor surgeries, whatever, they were being performed by women who had enough money to pay. So again, we go to the issue of class, like people who have enough money to pay to get an abortion, even though it was legal from a doctor, and people who didn't have the means to pay, so then chose other means in which to terminate their pregnancy. And again, it goes back to us framing this as reproductive right. So, this idea that, women who have abortions are somehow just don't care or are evil or don't care about life, etc., is completely untrue. Like, a lot of people who have abortion think through it carefully before they do it, and they've gone through all their options and they've decided that is the choice for them. And I don't really know why that is so hard to believe, that a lot of women can make up their own minds, can go through all the evidence, all the options available to them, and choose that. And again, it's going back to the point I've been making all of it today. Like, if you believe that abortion is morally wrong or whatever, fine, you are entitled to that belief, but you are not entitled to impose that belief on other people. That's so absolutely wrong.
What's your response to that, Ryan? That you, if you don't want an abortion, don't have an abortion, but don't impose it on other people.
Yeah, there are several elements to that. First and foremost, Barbara, I consider you probably to be a human rights activist in your own regard. I think you consider yourself that. And one of the founding principles of the human rights and social justice movement is that we don't leave anybody behind.
The key thing, body being here, and we can walking and talking,
and we can come to that, and so we can have a very reasonable disagreement on when we think, let's say, personhood begins, even if not human life, but we can assume the best in each other in that. And so what I'm saying is, someone that does believe that human life begins at conception is that principle that I think you would respect in other circumstances holds, that we don't leave anybody behind, regardless of how vulnerable they are, how small they are, what their IQ is, how much care they need. That is just a principle that we should all abide by, and that's a foundational principle for the human rights movement.
I think this is an important.
The characteristics you've described are all assigned to a human that is currently in the world, however small their IQ, their race,
Let me
gender,
first of all ask Barbara. So when we're talking about a fetus, let's say, in early stages of development, say the first 8 weeks or something like that, do you use the word? Would you say that is a human?
No, I would say that's the fetus. That's the medical term for it. I mean, even that's why in the law there is a limit as to when women can decide. And actually, even for the furthest limit of where the law allows it, we know that actually not a high number of women have late stage abortions.
Would you say that because I assume you're advocating for that women should be able to have an abortion at any point?
I'm not advocating for women should be able to have abortion at any point. I think that's a conversation between a woman and their healthcare provider. I mean, currently
to have the choice.
Yeah, no, to have the choice. Currently, as the law stands, there is a limit.
She should be able to.
There is
a
limit, right? My issue really isn't about. I don't think the limit should be reversed. I don't really think the limit should be. I think that's.
So you're happy with the limit as it stands?
I'm happy with the limit as it stands.
That's interesting.
What I'm actually concerned about is the criminalisation of women. That is is why I don't want the procedure
it's just interesting because
right?
I did an abortion discussion with Anne Furedi of BPAS, who was part of that. And what was interesting about her was she actually thinks time limits should be removed altogether because she thinks it's an arbitrary thing almost, whether it's just before 20 weeks or just after 20
weeks. It is
an
arbitrary thing, but that is what we have in the law currently.
The other thing that she differs from you on is that she was quite happy to say it's absolutely a human being from the moment of conception. It's genetically human. Her difference is she doesn't believe it has the same rights at that stage of development.
I don't believe it has the same rights. Again, rights are assigned to individuals that are in the world currently walking I'm just trying to hear frame what your kind of overall view is of this. Do you believe that in the course of development that child, that fetus, that child, whatever, accrues more rights? So at the point where they're now at system,
8,
is it?
well, that's the point, I suppose. Is the 8-month developed child in the womb? Should we treat that child differently to the 6 weeks?
We're not dealing with the child. We're dealing with the person. And I want to go back to a point you said that it's directing its own development, but only need to help in. And actually, no. If it's not in a woman's body, it will not be able to grow. Like, that woman is looking after themselves, taking their vitamins, eating well, doing all this, abstaining from alcohol, all of these things to enable that baby to develop. And again, for me, it goes back to the point where I don't really think that you are considering what women want and the choice that they have, and the fact that they, as their bodies, play a massive role in this process. So should actually have the right to decide whether they're going to play that massive role, which they play, or decide not to. And again, it goes back to the point, because if the woman stops eating, that's going to have an impact on development. So I don't think that,
yeah, well, obviously the way what a woman does with her body will have a direct impact on the health of the child she's carrying.
So why shouldn't she be the one to choose whether or not she wants to carry a pregnancy to full term or not? Like, for me, rights are assigned to individuals, right?
Where do you stand on this whole issue of the type of rights a child in the womb has versus, obviously, Barbara feels a woman's right as the living, breathing, able to do stuff adult in the situation easily trumps that of a what I guess you would call potential life, rather than Barbara. But yeah, right.
Yeah, I think it comes down to whether it's a human being and whether it's a human person or not, and that is the central question here when we're talking about assigning rights or recognizing rights that somebody already has inherently. And that is my view. Every human person inherently has rights, because they're a human being, individual human being. And the type of care that's needed, or the context of that care, shouldn't impinge on the rights that person has. Their status or value or dignity shouldn't be affected by what's needed to help them flourish. And so I would reply very directly to that self-directed comment. That is a medical fact that is in several books on embryology that you can just read. It is the pituitary gland of the embryo that directs so much of the development of what goes on around it. Yes, it needs the nutrients from its mother, just as a baby outside of the womb needs the nutrients of its mother. And I think you, as someone that does care about social justice and does care about helping the vulnerable, which I know you deeply care about, wouldn't recommend that in any other circumstance than abortion, somebody's care is taken away because it might be a sacrificial burden on that community or on that person to help them to flourish like they would be able to fulfill their potential. I think this is the only circumstance where you would make that argument, that self-sacrifice by the community trumps the fundamental and absolute rights of the vulnerable.
I mean, what I'm getting from what you're saying there, Ryan, to Barbara, is a mother would be committing a criminal act if they didn't look after their child who is born, or had refused to feed or even kill that child, obviously. And you don't see what the big difference is between that example of a child being dependent on their mother outside the womb and a child being dependent on their mother inside the womb. As
a moral act, I don't see the difference, right? They're both terrible. Inside or outside the womb, it's a terrible result for that small child, in my view. It's also a terrible result for the mother in terms of the effect that has on her too. But that is not to downplay that anybody who's pro-life in any way doesn't recognise what unique situation a woman is in and how sacrificial that process of pregnancy is for that woman. I cannot begin to imagine how difficult that is. And so I really want to emphasise that.
So I think let's tease this out. What's the difference in terms of the dependency of the child who is outside the womb, has been born obviously, and the mother, and the child who is still inside the womb? Because in that sense, I mean, it's almost as though I've put it this way, that the journey through the birth canal suddenly imbues, it would appear, the child with a whole set of rights they didn't have only 5 minutes before when they were inside. So what's I suppose the question is, what's the big difference between a child who is developed inside the womb and a child who has just been born, and now you would be a criminal if you were to kill them, and there might be only 5 minutes difference and a change of geography.
I mean, it's not the time, and it's not a change of geography, is it? Because when they're in the womb, they're dependent on the mother. When they're outside, they're breathing themselves. Do you know what I mean? And, as a social thing, or, also a fundamental thing, like the woman or whoever it is will look after the child, give them food, breastfeed, all of those things. I think that's completely different. And again, like I've said before, this is really semantics at the end of the day. Like, if you don't believe that women should have the right to choose to have an abortion, you are completely entitled to that view. For me, I see it as part of reproductive health and as part of women's reproductive rights to choose when it is they want to have abortions. And actually, if we have lots of things available, maybe, and I'm not saying if we have lots of things available for abortion can be taken away, I think abortion is still a fundamental right. Lots of women wouldn't find themselves in that position where they're having to choose whether or not to have a child, because they would have, through, science that we have, carefully planned out what it is they want. But we know that access isn't available. And again, it goes back to the point I've been making this whole time. You can't force a woman to do something. You can disagree, and that's completely fine. But I think to make a law that says that they have to because of your moral belief, which is a choice that you have taken, I think that that's wrong.
But the moral belief is, the law, sort of to some extent, is there because even the 20-week law here in the UK is there because presumably the government believes that after that point the child has a certain number of rights, right? So it's like even in that situation, it feels like there is some belief in the idea that a woman's right to choose doesn't apply after 20 weeks, that they can't simply ask for an abortion apart from on certain grounds. But again,
it's going back to the point that I've said before. We know that very, very, even with the time limit we have, very, very few women have abortion very close to the time limit. Sure. A lot of them are a lot earlier because people have gone through their options and they've decided that
it is rare to have late-term abortion. I accept that.
That is what, and that's what the law has put in place. Whatever, that's complete. And again, but I'm going back to women being fundamentally able to choose that option for them. And like I said, this is sort of painted as, again, you made the point about what was it you said? Like it's a blessing, it's a gift to be pregnant, to bring a life. Well, not a lot of people feel that way, in the same way that we can't imply that, everyone who is a woman has mothering instincts or want to have children, right? Like, this is the point we're trying to make. Your idea of what that is doesn't apply to everyone. Okay. So your standard should now not be imposed on everyone just because that's what you believe, right?
Okay. Ryan?
Yeah, I mean, there are lots of things. There are lots of things you've said each time, and I'll respond to a couple. The first, that to care about the scientific reality of a human being coming into existence is semantics. I think is unfortunate because I think it's anti-scientist, ultimately anti-scientific. Earlier you said I should care if an egg is wasted or not, and that should be a moral equivalent. So that's not a scientific statement either. I believe in the science, which is that an individual human being comes into existence when an egg is fertilized by a sperm and becomes a zygote. And you talked about words like fetus showing that isn't a human person. Well, that's Latin for young one, which recognizes implicitly that it's a young human that is in existence in the womb. So this isn't semantics. This is science, and this is philosophy, and it's logic, and it's common sense, all at the same time. So I think that's just a really convenient sidestep about what is human life and when it begins. And so I really would like to press you on that, actually. Like, when does a human life begin in that continuum for you, and what are the reasons for it? Are they just semantic reasons in your case?
No, they're not semantic reasons. Again, I've got back to my point lots of different times that women get to decide what it is that they want to do. For me, whether it's a life or not, for me, it really isn't an option. At the end of the day, the woman is the one that's pregnant, and they get to decide what to do with their body.
I'm assuming here, Barbara, that you don't believe children can be killed after they've been born, right?
No, absolutely
infanticide
not.
is wrong.
No.
Okay.
But why?
Absolutely.
Why would that be the case? What would your reasoning be?
No, because that individual is now here in the world.
What difference does that make? Because they're in the world, but in their mother's womb. Say that 10 minutes before they'd been here in the world in their mother's womb. I'm just trying to sound. What's the fundamental difference? What happens?
No, because they're now a human being. Like, they're now, physically here, like outside of their own personhood. It's, as far as I'm concerned.
So personhood happens at the moment they're born, rather than when they're in the womb.
Because when they're in the womb, that's still that woman that's giving that individual life at the moment. If that woman stops breathing, anything happens to them or anything, sometimes children can survive, but sometimes they don't. Like, that's going to have a fundamental that pregnancy and that woman are intrinsically linked, and it's when they're separated that actually.
I'm sorry to press you on this, but I wanted to kind of get sort of a sense of what it is that changes. Where do the rights come from? Because that's kind of our question on the table.
Yeah.
And for you, it's when they're born, and they're no longer dependent on the environment of the woman's body,
absolutely,
and can survive independently in that sense. So
could I summarize? Could I summarize your position then, Barbara, as existing and being wanted? Could I summarize your position as you get those rights in that situation by existing in the world and being wanted? Because the opposite case is not being wanted and not being in the world in the sense of being outside of the womb. Is that the key difference for you between before and after? Wantedness.
People can still have the child and then put them up for adoption because they don't necessarily want them, but they didn't want to have an abortion because that's not what they believe in. I don't think the key thing is being wanted. I think the key thing is being born. That's a completely different ballgame.
Right.
Like, people can have children and not want them, put them up for adoption. In some cases, abandon them not in a very safe way as well. Like, that's a different thing. They've not wanted that child, but they've made that choice to have that child, and that child is now here as an individual, so has rights and protection under the law. That's how it currently stands for me. That's how I understand, and that's what I believe. Yeah. But it's not about being wanted, because that's two different things. Like, people can have children and not want them and give them up. Mm-hmm. People can have children and want them. That's a completely different. The key thing is that child is now here as an individual
so it's
on their own.
The child being born outside of the womb that is where the rights come into force in that sense.
And so you've just summarised my position, both before and after the womb, in fact. And so then all we're left with, actually, is whether you are in the womb or not, pre or post-birth. That's what we're left with after what you say about wantedness, which I happen to agree with. So what is it about being in amniotic fluid inside a uterus as opposed to being on a hospital bed a couple of minutes later? There's a famous photograph of a child being having surgery performed on it, 21 weeks, and the child is grasping the finger of the surgeon that is operating on it at 21 weeks. It's then sewn back into the womb and is born because it's wanted. What you're saying is a baby at 29, 30 weeks, 32 weeks can be dismembered.
But
because
they're
not wanted and because of location.
No, it's not about being wanted. That's all happened because that's a choice the mother has made. The mother has said, I want X. Like, that's, again, these are all choices. You're saying it like women get pregnant and it's just like they have to have the baby. Like, these are all choices, whether people choose to keep or whether people choose not to keep.
You used this phrase earlier, which I think might be helpful here to distinguish your positions, but you talked about the bodily autonomy of a woman.
Absolutely.
And so if that was the framework, as long as anything is within my body, I have a right to do what I would like to do because it's my body. That's the sense of bodily autonomy.
Right, yeah.
That's the right.
Yeah.
And that trumps, in a sense, any rights, developing rights, even up to the point of birth of a child in the womb, because as long as it's in the woman's body, the bodily autonomy right trumps, if you like, any other rights that might be there or not.
Well, any other rights? I don't... Any other rights I'm not quite understanding that,
I'm
because
saying
the right is with
the right to life.
No. The right to life is with the individual that's here. Like, you have the, like, if somebody then now take, like,
but I think
that's
what
your
the
right.
point Ryan's making is there is an individual here in his view. It just happens to be in a womb in amniotic fluid.
Yeah.
But it's the point that it's in that environment, and therefore it's the bodily autonomy. I'm just trying to make sense of your different positions.
Yeah, because it's impacting.
That's the thing that trumps the other right of a child to live, essentially, which they would have if they were simply delivered and on the the hospital bed at that point. That they would have a right that they didn't have moments before in the womb, in that sense. I mean,
because they're here.
They're
and physically here. In the womb, they're intrinsically linked. Like,
so
it's that woman's right.
Do you think that a child in the womb is a part of the mother's body?
Absolutely.
Right. Okay.
Absolutely.
Do you not, Ryan?
She's growing that child. If she was to stop, again, goes back to my point. If that woman wasn't looking after themselves, that child is going to struggle to continue to grow and to survive. That's the science, right? That's why women have to take certain tablets when they're pregnant. They have to eat right. They have to keep going to hospital to get checked. Those are all those are all choices that people make because that's what they want.
I agree
that. Back to the point. And again, like I said, I think this is a belief thing. You believe something completely different from me, and that is okay. It will kind of be like going around finding out that people don't believe in God, don't believe in Jesus, don't believe that he died for our sins, and forcing them to, and saying, actually, no, you're wrong. You have to, and imposing that on them, and perhaps legislating that people who don't believe in God, whatever, shouldn't exist, etc., etc. I don't think that that's in the Christian spirit. Absolutely.
We'll let Ryan respond to that after a quick break, and we'll continue this. It's been a lively discussion today. Is abortion a human right? We're asking on Unbelievable. My guests are Barbara Ntumy and Ryan Christopher, and we'll be concluding today's discussion very shortly.
If you listen to Unbelievable with Justin Briley on Premier Christian Radio and enjoy the conversations between Christians and skeptics, then this is the perfect app for you. For the latest updates, podcasts, videos, articles, bonus content and much more, download the Premier Unbelievable app today.
So as we conclude today's discussion, again, a quick reminder that this is a topic that's of a sensitive nature. Just be aware of that as you're listening. If you're listening especially via radio, you can, of course, get hold of the programme via podcast. And we've been talking about abortion. Is it a human right? Ryan Christopher, Senior Policy Officer for ADF International in London, joins me and will be part of the team speaking at Unbelievable Conference as well a little bit later on in July. Barbara Ntumy, part of Abortion Rights, has been making the pro-choice case in this particular discussion, and it's been a lively and a good-natured one as well, actually, even though you obviously vigorously disagree with each other. Ryan, as we start to close this up, what are the particular things? I mean, I think in that last section, choice is absolutely essential, and even making the point that you wouldn't legislate against people not being able to believe in Jesus and that sort of thing. Don't legislate people's personal conscience when it comes to an issue of, is this child a human with rights or whatever. It's their body, their right. Bodily autonomy trumps any other possible theories we might have about a child's rights and so on in the womb. So is that an equivalent thing, legislating against people's beliefs versus what the status of a child is and so on?
No, I don't think they're equivalent, and I think I need to start with this notion that the child in the womb is a part of its mother's body, because that's not, again, scientifically true, or I think philosophically defensible either. So I'll give an extreme example that illustrates that point. There have been women that tragically have been left in terrible accidents and have been officially brain dead, actually. So that's a standard that would allow you to have your organs harvested in this country and really officially declared dead. But they've been kept on life support machines that allows them their heart to beat and their circulatory system and nutrients given to that woman who is pregnant at that time. And what we've found is that that woman is capable of giving birth. That baby can still be brought to term because that baby is not the woman. That baby is not brain dead like the mother is. It's an independent human person. It's not a rock or a tiger or a tree. It's a human person that has self-directed growth inside the womb and, yes, needs extreme extraordinary sacrificial care from the mother, the kind of sacrificial care that I think we all believe in outside of the womb. And with regards to this absolute right to autonomy, Barbara, I don't think you believe in that, actually, in all circumstances, in most cases. I think you do believe that certain things should be criminal. I think you do believe that certain acts are immoral and violate fundamental rights. And I think you do believe that, therefore, there should be criminal laws against those acts and possibly even punishments for them. And so this absolute right to choose is a myth. I don't think we are all absolutely pro-choice. I don't think you'd be in favour of me choosing the level of taxation I pay, never mind whether I could do somebody else a damage. And so the question really is, which rights are absolute rights and which rights are contingent rights that depend on other circumstances or other rights? The right to life has been universally recognised since the 1948 Universal Declaration of Human Rights and remains in international law for good reason as an absolute right that every human being should have that right to life respected and should be recognised as a person in the law, including in the womb as well. The right to my autonomy, so, I have a right to wiggle my arms around all I want to some extent, but once it starts infringing on your face, for example, to use a silly example, then those rights aren't absolute anymore. And so the notion that bodily autonomy which is a contingent right, can trump an absolute right to life is basically the big difference, I think, between us and in what you were saying earlier.
Yeah. We are going to start to close things out, but I'll obviously give you a chance to respond there to Ryan, and then we'll have some final thoughts. Again,
I disagree, because for me, what I find sometimes really hard is that a lot of effort, and a couple of weeks ago we were in Parliament Square and March for Life were around, and what I see is a lot of were you? Same place, same time. What I see is a lot of time and effort being put in to A, sometimes change women's mind, B, change laws that mean women can't make choices that I think, and I strongly believe they should be able to make, over what I would consider currently in the world we live in a dire need for people who are already here to be advocated for, in the sense that they also have a right to life and to dignity that they're not experiencing at the expense of other people. So we think about this country being, in the top 10 richest country in the world, yet homelessness is massively on the rise, lots of children in care, spending cuts, disabled people are losing their lives because this government is cutting support that they desperately need, right? Okay, so I want to see that same energy being directed towards things that are actually impacting the right to life of people who are here and have existed for a long time. In the same way, you believe that you are advocating for a right that is of a unborn child in the womb. Okay, if that's what you believe, I want to see consistency across the board, and I don't see that consistency across the board. And
that's often the argument that's made.
As a person that believes in the woman's right to choose, actually do try and practice consistency across the board, advocating for people who are here, advocating for homelessness, advocating for cuts being dropped against the impact in the lives of disabled people. Again, going back to one of the richest countries in the world, we're seeing kids go to school hungry, people who are working are going to food banks in order to survive.
That's often
I want to see that same energy. If that is what you believe,
that's often a criticism that pro-lifers aren't.
Quickly.
Yeah, okay.
I want to see if that is what you believe. I want to see that same energy across the board. I'm not saying that you're not doing it personally. I'm just saying
generally in the pro-life movement.
I don't see it enough. I don't see enough of that same energy across the board, because this is obviously something that we disagree on, which is fair enough. And again, I fundamentally believe in a woman's right to choose. I don't think that you should legislate against it in the same way we would legislate against people who don't believe in God, who don't believe Jesus Christ died for our sins. And I think it's, again, it's your belief that you are allowed to hold, but I don't think you should impose it on other people.
Yeah, I mean, I won't speak for myself. You say I believe. I'll speak for many of the women I know and what the polling shows, which is that women agree with that sentiment that you have, Barbara, that we should be putting effort in around the board for every individual human person to protect and help them. And that includes women who have unplanned pregnancies. And if you look at the polling, not only do women want reductions in time limit, want more recognition of unborn life in the womb, want closer safeguards in the criminal law for medical practitioners around abortion, and they want the right to have to go to see a doctor so that they can report coercion if that's going on. Not only do women in this country want those things on the polling, but they also want, a good 80% want, increased spending for women who are in unplanned pregnancies. And I think that is a demographic that has been completely ignored when we talk about those in need and who are vulnerable in our society.
Yeah. Look, it's been great having you both on the show today. Really appreciate, obviously vigorously disagree with each other, but that's the nature of the show. But I've been glad that you've been able to have it in a good spirit, and appreciate you both coming on. I'll make sure there are links to both your organisations from today's show. You can find that at premierchristianradio.com/unbelievable. But for the moment, Barbara and Ryan, thank you very much for being with me.
Thank you.
Thanks.
For more conversations between Christians and skeptics, subscribe to the Unbelievable podcast. And for more updates and bonus content, sign up to the Unbelievable newsletter.